This was a difficult time, difficult for everyone. Back and forth between Colorado and California, in and out of different homes as my parents began to marry other people. It was in one of the times when Dad had left us with some other people, and he was finding work that he got a toothache. And he said he couldn't really afford to go to a dentist, but he finally found a really inexpensive dentist, probably somebody who wasn't licensed to practice dentistry. And his dad said there were 30 people waiting to see him. Again, you can imagine when there was not health insurance and there was not money to buy or pay for good medical services. Apparently this dentist did not use good hygiene or antiseptic tools, and my father got a very serious abscess, and it was caused by bacteria. It was called Ludwig's angina, and what happens with Ludwig's angina, it comes almost always from some dental work, is that the bottom of the mouth begins to swell and the tongue begins to swell and the throat begins to close in. And Dad had a temperature. They rushed him to the emergency room, and they called in. Dad said there were 10 or 12 doctors. I don't know whether his statistics are accurate, but he said only one person out of 1,000 survived in those days from Ludwig's angina. This was before a lot of the antibiotics and things, and so they called for his family to come to see him because they didn't expect he would live. He had met a Mormon woman not long before this. I don't know whether they dated or not, but she came to see him in the hospital and said, would you let me bring the elders to administer to you? My dad says, I don't know what that is, but if you want to do it, that's okay. And so these elders, he remembers them by name. He remembered them by name. Came and administered to him. The next day he was out. They had actually put him in, those days they had a place in the hospital they called the death ward, where they didn't expect people to survive. They just put them there to wait till they died. And that's where he was. And the next day he was out of the death ward, and in a week he was out of the hospital. And the doctors said, you have the constitution of a mule. We haven't seen anyone recover from this illness as you have. My father had no religious life before then. Interestingly enough, even though my great-grandparents had joined the Mormon Church in Fishguard, Wales in the 1850s, and even though my great-grandfather had for a period of time been a Mormon, but then left and joined the reorganized Mormon Church, my grandfather, whose name was Zoram, after a Book of Mormon character, was never a Mormon. But when my father was 12, the Mormon missionaries came through southwestern Colorado and taught the gospel to my grandmother and my aunts, and they joined the church. But my father didn't at age 12. And as I mentioned, he had no religious life up to the time of this illness. But what happened had a dramatic impact on his life. From that time on, my father was a person of great faith. And even though there were long periods of time when he didn't live the principles of the gospel, and when he wasn't active in the church, he never lost his conviction, either of that experience or of the reality of God, or of the truth of the Book of Mormon, or of the goodness of Christ and his gospel. So in terms of turning points in my life, this was another turning point, because even though I was a young child at that time and had no knowledge of this experience until my father told it to me when I interviewed him, I could see how in many ways it helped to define my life. Anyway, things, as I mentioned, were hard. My father when he had left Bill and me with our mother, he went back to Arizona where his sisters were living, and south of Prescott. And at the bottom of Yarnell Hill of the mountain, there was a bar and a dance hall, and he went there. They would go there for dances, and there he met Faye, Bunilla Faye White, a woman who had been married before and who had 2 daughters, and they fell in love and started living together. She became pregnant with my younger brother Clayton, and then my father and Faye got married and were living in Prescott. And that's when my father came back to Colorado to get Bill and me, and to go and live with him and his new wife and their family. I think of how hard it was for my mother, for my father to come back. She's having, in a sense, said she had no children when she got her divorce. She had no legal claim on us. I can remember vaguely hiding behind her because my father was 6'3", had a very deep voice, and it was dark, and I was frightened of him when he came. I didn't know who this man was who was coming to take us away from our mother. Anyway, we moved to Prescott and there lived with Dad and Faye and Faye's 2 daughters and their new child, Clayton. And we lived there for a period of time. Dad was doing everything he could to find work. He got a job digging a well for a man. He dug it by hand 30 feet down, hauling the dirt out by bucket loads. And then the man refused to pay him. He said, well, you didn't have a contractor's license and I'm not obligated to pay you. This was the kind of thing that my father sometimes found, and he found people taking advantage of him. On 3 different occasions, people stole everything he had and left him penniless. He talks about one time when he left Billy and me when he had to go find work. This was earlier, and he said maybe the saddest day of my life was I had to leave you boys, and he said I left you and I walked away and looked back and you were both standing at the door crying your hearts out. And he said, I felt so terrible. And I said, Dad, how did you survive these times? And he said, you didn't have a choice. It was hard and you had to do it. And you had to keep going. And I think that ethic is something that is deeply ingrained in my life. To never give up, to call on whatever reserves you have to do what you have to do. And I saw my father doing that on many occasions. Life was difficult there. He finally found a job taking care of a dairy. So we moved to a dairy in a place called Hackberry in Arizona, rural Arizona. And my father milked 35 cows by hand twice a day, and then delivered the milk on a milk route 120 miles for 371 days in a row, He worked 18 hours a day. I can remember living on that dairy farm. Of course, we were kids. What did we know? We had no idea of how difficult it was for him and for Faye. We were just, kids growing up in poverty without knowing we were poor. We had milk to drink and butter because of the dairy, and Dad was always a good farmer and had garden and had vegetables. And so we were, as Huck Finn would say, we were happy as any creature. But we didn't know how challenging it was for them. And as I look back on it, it's difficult for me to imagine how hard it must have been to work that hard for that long. It kind of, in a way, it wore my father out, at least for a period of time.